being joined by a lady who was once here. Well, she's no stranger to the Observer, the head of UWI's Institute for Gender and Development Studies. Let me say a pleasant good evening to Dr. Ann Barratt. Good evening, Doctor.
Good evening. Good to be with you again.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, yeah, circumstances, unfortunate when we have this discussion. Something would have, triggered it. And yesterday, of course, was no different. Of course, I want to send condolences to everyone that was affected in that incident in San Fernando yesterday. But
yes.
but that culture that still exists, and when I look at it, Dr. Barratt, you have people who would say, listen, the young people who are involved in criminal activity, the question is asked about their parents, and of course we all a product of our environment. But many times when we talk about marriage, I mean, the true character comes out, because everyone is always prepared for the wedding day, but are they prepared for the long haul, the mental long haul of a marriage, where it gets to the point that you may be so intimate with this individual that you yourself can't seem to picture them with anyone else? And if that be the case, if you want to leave, and if I can't have you, then no one else can have you, and I don't even deserve to live after that. So it's a matter of committing that gruesome murder and then taking their own lives. How did we get here?
All right, so you asked three big questions. One was, are people ready for marriage? How did we get to this violence? And how do people, I guess, negotiate the falling apart of their relationship? Of course, condolences to all involved. This is another terrible moment for us. This is days before we commemorate International Day to End Violence Against Women and Girls, which is on Saturday, November 25th, and marking the start of the 16 days of activism to end gender-based violence. And in this case, we had the perpetrator killing themselves, and of course the innocent bystander also being murdered. And then, of course, the trauma of all the onlookers who would have seen this incident. I would like to suggest, how did it start? That this is not just an interpersonal crime, that you are with someone, you suffer heartache, and you cannot handle the loss or rejection or the departure of this person. It is more complex than that. It is rooted, and I'm sorry to have to say this, but it is rooted in how we have constructed marriage as a relationship of obligation, of ownership, and of exchange, along with marriage as a relationship of love and commitment and merging families and all of that. We don't like to admit to the former, because it confronts our ethical position. But we have constructed marriage in a way that is dangerous when we think outside of the love, commitment, storyline, narrative. And so what happens when a lot of this is not an incident that is unique to Trinidad and Tobago. It appears across the globe. And it appears with often male perpetrators and female victims. Of course, there are other occurrences, but this is the trend. It is because you have set up a situation where when someone leaves or attempts to leave, it is not just a loss of the love of my life, it's a loss of that which I own and am entitled to, because of the institution and how it sets up that relationship. So we have more than an interpersonal problem to deal with, which is my point. It started with the construction of marriage as an institution, an exchange between families, between kinship groups, between even cultural groups. And then we have mapped on the interpersonal. So unless we are willing to start to disrupt that for its toxicity and threats to family and family security and individual security, then the problem will keep persisting.
But are we ever told of these things prior to, engaging in any sort of intimate relationship? That, listen, there are some things that you have to factor in. It's not just about, he loving you or you loving him, but there are some things that need to be discussed. And quite frankly, we don't discuss these things for whatever reason. Maybe it's not part of our culture.
No, it's a reason. The right reason is taboos. We have Transvague was a country with a strange extreme around human sexual relations, around sex in itself. We are both extremely repressed and extremely hypersexual, but we don't have discussions around human sexuality, around feelings of desire, around dealing with conflict, around feelings of the heart. We don't discuss these things. We may have, peer groups. We may have marriage counseling where you try to address it, but it is so taboo around human sexuality.
But let me ask you, well, I understand that. I mean, going back to that whole thing about it takes a village to raise a child, it would definitely take some collective ideology, compatible ideology for each of us to have that support system. But that's not how it's viewed. I mean, the first thing that comes to the mind of here, of course, is that, well, somebody get horn. We simply say that, boy, somebody get horn, somebody. I remember as a young boy, I'm telling my uncle, a friend of mine, his girlfriend likes me. And his reply was, well, that's not your partner, girl, again. That's yours now, And these are things that you hear growing up.
So that's an unfortunate presumption, because when you say, this extreme situation has occurred because somebody get on, it's almost as if you're trying to rationalize deservingness. Whether somebody got on or somebody just left or there was violence or people just couldn't be compatible or whatever is the reason, this outcome is never acceptable, right? So I think we do that because it allows us to dismiss the difficult to explain. It's very hard to explain and rationalize and come to terms with very complex issues because of our belief system, because of the way we understand things, the way we communicate. So every time these incidents occur, it's always heartbreaking, but it's also very frustrating because we keep trying to say we must confront the limits of what we think is knowable. And because we are not willing to do so, because it's confrontational to our belief or our fantasy about how we form relationships, we keep perpetuating the same problem.
Yeah, but how do we go beyond that? I mean, a culture basically is the social DNA of the people. It means that it's deep rooted. How do you overcome that when people are not going to come and have this conversation and say, listen, there are more factors here. We're not just going to stop somebody get horn and that's it, and that justifies the fact that somebody went out there and committed a gruesome act. It can't be. How do we go beyond that? As the world has evolved, we have evolved. People are finding their places, whether it be gender, whatever the case may be. It's not business as usual. But as a people that have been so accustomed to justifying it by saying, somebody just went outside of the range or outside of the marriage. How do we go beyond it?
Well, there are three levels, and they are all rooted in what we see as our community. Structurally, at one level, and I know that there's a lot of public discourse about it, but we need to teach children to understand their social relationships, understand what they can expect. They must be socialized to think about what it means to be in close, attached, romantic sexual relationships with another human being. This is why we need comprehensive sexuality education and health and family life education. And I know people are resisting it because they imagine it to be something that it is not. So that's number one. Secondly, within family, within community, within peer groups, within all of these spaces, we have to give people room to express themselves, talk to you about their frustration, and allow them to understand the difference between what they expect, what the reality is, but we don't allow people to talk. You know what we say to people? We say, everything will be all right, man. Go and say a prayer about it, or just take a drink, or whatever it is, and we push it aside, but we have to accommodate the conversation so it doesn't escalate. So that's at the level of community. We have the level of education. And thirdly, we have to consistently, every day, through mass media, through all other social media, the forms of communication, recast the narrative about relationships, that it is not about ownership. It is about companionship. And it's not just in Trinidad and Tobago, but we romanticize and fantasize being owned and owning others. And that needs to shift, and that will be the most difficult, because that's a cultural belief system, ideology, way to stories we tell ourselves that seems good but is really bad. So I would suggest there are three ways we start with our children and educate them about the things we have difficulty talking about, and have professionals, teachers in the education system and parents collaborate for that purpose. Secondly, within community, we encourage people to communicate and give room and speak to them with empathy and not judgment. And three, that we change our cultural messages, the stories, myths, and narratives we tell ourselves.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%, especially with number three, the stories that we tell ourselves. And I think we need to understand that what we may look at as trivial can definitely have a very, very gruesome end. The end game is not going to be good.
Exactly.
Yeah, someone comes to you and you have to understand, and some people would say, listen, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not trained for this. You get your horn, you take your horn, you go your way. But understand something, many people are not accustomed to crying out for help, especially men in our society. They're not. So, again, it has to have that support system where other men would say, listen, you want to talk about it, let's find out what's going on here and see how best we can come up with something.
Of course, and remember, you see, some people might feel distance from themselves. They might feel sad to see somebody has been killed. But until it enters your doorstep and you understand the levels of loss for children, for family, for neighborhoods, for communities, then you'd realize, oh, I should put aside the expectations of masculinities and femininities and just allow a person to be a human. I'm depressed, I'm sad, I'm hurt, I'm confused about something. Can I talk to you? And that's okay. But we have a tendency to judge and blame and exclude people from having that conversation. Of course, around masculinity, there are these very strict limits about expressing yourselves, which we've been trying to grapple for decades, but it continues to be a hard task. Yeah. And then around femininity, there are also boundaries around respectability and so forth. So unless we are willing as a community to say we could actually talk to each other, we could talk to our parents, we could talk to our family, our friends, then that's the interpersonal level.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are red flags there, and I think we can identify the red flags. I mean, this person is definitely going through something, and before it gets out of hand, I think you're right. As a society, we need to change our entire outlook as far as that culture of just shrugging it off and saying it is what it is. If you had one message, we're about out of time, but if you had one message that you can share tonight so we wouldn't have a repeat of these things so often, what would that be?
Well, my message is almost desperate. I would say you are not entitled to anyone else's love, affection, loyalty. You are not entitled. It is a gift. One, that's at the interpersonal. And at the second point, let us come together to educate each other about the nature of our human relationships from our school straight up to adulthood and our workplaces. And that way we can confront these situations that become toxic and dangerous.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Barratt. Thank you so much again. Very enlightening. Keep up the good work. And we will be checking in with you because this issue is it's a long and never-ending conversation, and we need it. It's time we change our outlook, and to do that, we have to change the way we start addressing things and looking into things. I want to thank you so much for that.
Thank you. All the best.
All the best.